Chapter 10. A few typical cures. This little work would be incomplete if it did not include a few examples of the cures obtained. It would take too long and would also perhaps be somewhat tiring if I were to relate all of those in which I had taken part. I will therefore content myself by quoting a few of the most remarkable. M.D. of Troyes had suffered for 8 years from asthma, which obliged her to sit up in bed nearly all night fighting for breath. Preliminary experiments show that she is a very sensitive object. She sleeps immediately, and a suggestion is given. From the first treatment, there is an enormous improvement. The patient has a good night, only interrupted by one attack of asthma, which only lasts a quarter of an hour. In a very short time, the asthma disappears completely, and there is no relapse later on. Patient A working Hoosier living at Saint-Savin near Troyes, paralyzed for 2 years as the result of injuries at the junction of the spinal column and the pelvis. The paralysis is only in the lower limbs, in which the circulation of the blood has practically ceased, making them swollen, congested, and discolored. Several treatments, including the antisyphilitic, have been tried without success. Preliminary experiments successful. Suggestion applied by me and AutoSuggestion by the patient for 8 days. At the end of this time, there is almost imperceptible but still appreciable movement of the left leg. Renewed suggestion. In 8 days, the improvement is noticeable. Every week or fortnight, there is an increased improvement with progressive lessening of the swelling, and so on. 11 months afterwards, on the 1st of November 1906, the patient goes downstairs alone and walks 800 yards, and in the month of July 1907, goes back to the factory, where he has continued to work since that time with no trace of paralysis. Patient C, living at Troyes, has long suffered from enteritis, for which different treatment have been tried in vain. He is also in a very bad state mentally, being depressed, gloomy, unsociable, and obsessed by thoughts of suicide. Preliminary experiments easy, followed by suggestion which produces an appreciable result from the very day. For 3 months, daily suggestions to begin with, then increasingly longer intervals. At the end of this time, the cure is complete. The enteritis has disappeared, and his morals have become excellent. As the cure dates back 12 years without the shadow of a relapse, it may be considered as permanent. He is a striking example of the effects that can be produced by suggestions, or rather by autosuggestion. At the same time as I made suggestions to him from the physical point of view, I also did so from the mental, and he accepted both suggestions equally well. Every day his confidence in himself increased, and as he was an excellent workman, in order to earn more, he looked out for a machine which would enable him to work at home for his employer. A little later, a factory owner, having seen with his own eyes what a good workman he was, entrusted him with the very machine he desired. Thanks to his skill, he was able to turn out much more than an ordinary workman, and his employer, delighted with the result, gave him another and yet another machine, until he, but for suggestion, would have remained an ordinary workman, is now in charge of 6 machines, which bring him a very handsome profit. Patient D of Troyes, at 30 years of age. She is in the last stages of consumption and grows thinner daily in spite of special nourishment. She suffers from coughing and spitting and has difficulty in breathing. In fact, from all appearances, she has only a few months to live. Preliminary experiments show great sensitiveness, and suggestion is followed by immediate improvement. From the next day, the morbid symptoms begin to lessen. Each day the improvement becomes more marked. The patient rapidly puts on flesh, although she no longer takes special nourishment. In a few months the cure is apparently complete. This person wrote to me on the 1st of January 1911, that is to say 8 months after I had left Troyes, to thank me and to tell me that although pregnant, she was perfectly well. I have purposely chosen these cases dating some time back in order to show that the cures are permanent, but I should like to add a few more recent ones. Patient D, post office clerk at Luneville, having lost one of his children in January 1910, the trouble produces in him a cerebral disturbance, which manifests itself by uncontrollable nervous trembling. His uncle brings him to me in the month of June. Preliminary experiments followed by suggestion. 4 days afterwards, the patient returns to tell me that the trembling has disappeared. I renew the suggestion and tell him to return in 8 days. A week, then a fortnight, then 3 weeks, then a month pass by without my hearing any more of him. Shortly afterwards, his uncle comes and tells me that he has just had a letter from his nephew, who is perfectly well. He has taken on again his work as a telegraph operator, which he had been obliged to give up on the day before he had sent off a telegram of 170 words without the least difficulty. He could easily, he added in his letter, have sent off an even longer one. Since then, he has had no relapse. Patient F of Nancy has suffered from neurasthenia for several years. He has aversions, nervous fears, and disorders of the stomach and intestines. He sleeps badly, is gloomy, and is haunted by ideas of suicide. He staggers when he walks like a drunken man, and can think of nothing but his trouble. All treatments have failed, and he gets worse and worse. A stay in a special nursing home for such cases has no effect whatever. He comes to see me at the beginning of October 1910. Preliminary experiments comparatively easy. I explain to the patient the principles of autosuggestion and the existence within us of the conscious and the unconscious self, and then make the required suggestion. For 2 or 3 days he has little difficulty with the explanations I have given him. In a short time light breaks in upon his mind and he grasps the whole thing. I renew the suggestion, and he makes it himself to every day. The improvement, which is at first slow, becomes more and more rapid, and in a month and a half the cure is complete. The ex-invalid, who had lately considered himself the most wretched of men, now thinks himself the happiest. Patient G of Troyes, an attack of gout. The right ankle is inflamed and painful, and he is unable to walk. The preliminary experiments show him to be a very sensitive subject. After the first treatment, he is able to regain, without the help of his stick, the carriage which brought him, and the pain has ceased. The next day he does not return as I had told him to do. Afterwards his wife comes alone and tells me that morning her husband had got up, put on his shoes, and gone off on his bicycle to visit his yards. It is needless to tell you my utter astonishment. I was not able to follow up this case, as the patient never deigned to come and see me again. But some time afterward I heard that he had no relapse. Patient K of Nancy, neurasthenia, dyspepsia, gastralgia, enteritis, and pains in different parts of the body. She has treated herself for several years with a negative result. I treat her by suggestion, and she makes autosuggestion for herself every day. From the first day there is a noticeable improvement, which continues without interruption. At the present moment this person has long been cured mentally and physically, and follows no regime. She thinks that she still has perhaps a slight touch of enteritis, but she is not sure. Patient K, a sister of patient F, acute neuralgia. She stays in bed a fortnight every month, as it is totally impossible for her to move or work. She suffers from lack of appetite, depression, and digestive disorders. She is cured by one visit, and the cure seems to be permanent, as she has had no relapse. Patient J of Maxville, general eczema, which is particularly severe on the left leg. Both legs are inflamed, above all the ankle. Walking is difficult and painful. I treat her by suggestion. That same evening she is able to walk several hundred yards without fatigue. The day after, the feet and ankles are no longer swollen, and have not been swollen since. The eczema disappears rapidly. Patient Q of Lannerville, pains in the kidney and the knees. The illness dates from 10 years back and is becoming worse every day. Suggestion for me and autosuggestion from herself. The improvement is immediate and increases progressively. The cure is obtained rapidly and is a permanent one. Patient M of Nancy fell ill in January 1910 with congestion of the lungs, from which she had not recovered 2 months earlier. She suffers from general weakness, loss of appetite, bad digestive control, rare and difficult bowel movements, insomnia, copious night sweats. After the first suggestion, the patient feels much better, and 2 days later she returns and tells me that she feels quite well. Every trace of illness has disappeared, and all the organs are functioning normally. 3 or 4 times she had been on the point of sweating, but each time prevented it by the use of conscious autosuggestion. From this time forward, she has enjoyed perfectly good health. Patient X at Belfort cannot talk for more than 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour without becoming completely aphomous. Different doctors consulted find no lesion in the vocal organs, but one of them says that Mr. X suffers from senility of the larynx, and this conclusion confirms him in the belief that he is incurable. He comes to spend his holidays at Nancy, and a lady of my acquaintance advises him to come and see me. He refuses at first, but eventually consents in spite of his absolute disbelief in the effects of suggestion. I treat him in this way nevertheless, and ask him to return 2 days afterwards. He comes back on the appointed day, and tells me that the day before he was able to converse the whole afternoon, without becoming aphomous. 2 days later he returns again to say that his trouble had not reappeared, although he had not only conversed a great deal, but even sung the day before. The cure still holds good, and I am convinced that it will always do so. Before closing, I should like to say a few words on the application of my method to the training and correction of children by their parents. The latter should wait until the child is asleep, and then one of them should enter his room with precaution, stop a yard from his bed, and repeat 15 or 20 times in a murmur all the things they wish to obtain from the child, from the point of view of health, work, sleep application, conduct. He should then retire as he came, taking great care not to awake the child. This extremely simple process gives the best possible results, and it is easy to understand why. When the child is asleep, his body and his conscious self are at rest, and as it were annihilated. His unconscious self, however, is awake. It is then to the latter alone that one speaks, and it is very credulous it accepts that one says it without dispute, so that little by little the child arrives at making of himself what his parents desire him to be. End of chapter.